Chinese President Xi Jinping begins his first state visit to the United States next week. He will begin his visit in Seattle, where he's expected to meet with U.S. business leaders. Then it's on to Washington and a meeting with U.S. President Barack Obama at the White House. From there, he's scheduled to address the UN General Assembly in New York. For a preview of the highly anticipated visit, I sat down with China's ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai, at the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
You're
welcome, sir. You have attended previous meetings between President Xi Jinping and President Barack Obama. What are President Xi Jinping's key objectives during this visit to the United States?
Well, this is the first state visit by President Xi Jinping to the United States. But he has already established a very good working relationship with President Obama. They met at Sunnylands the year before last. Last November, they had a very substantive and long meeting in Beijing, right in the center of Zhongnanhai. So I'm sure this time the two presidents will continue their strategic dialogue on the relationship, on the major issues involved, and perhaps also on international situation. And they will give us a clear sense, or a clearer sense of direction, where this relationship should be going, and how we should achieve the goal of having or establishing a new model of major country relationship.
Talking about international cooperation, of course, these countries are two big economic partners. There's also been a great deal of cooperation on global issues, things like climate change, the Iran nuclear deal. How crucial is it for these two countries to ensure that this visit is a success?
Well, first of all, we have to make sure this visit is a great success for the sake of the bilateral relationship, because we have such an important, strategic, comprehensive, and complex relationship between China and the United States. And it will certainly serve the interests of the peoples of both countries if the visit is a great success. Number two, China and the United States are two of the major countries in the world. We are both permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. We are the two largest economies in the world, although the gap between us is still huge. So we do share the responsibility that we develop a healthy, sustained, and stable relationship, and try to make our joint contribution to the solution of international regional issues.
China's growth in the past 35 years rather, has been phenomenal. It's, as you've just pointed out, one of the biggest economies in the world with the United States. What is President Xi Jinping's vision for China, and what is the message that he's going to be bringing to the United States, not just the United States leaders, but also to the American people?
I think that the vision of the president, actually the vision of the Chinese people, is very simple. It is what we call the Chinese dream, the revitalization of the Chinese nation. And we do have two centenary goals. I think during the visit, President Xi will present this thinking, this goal, and China's peaceful development, China's development strategy, China's foreign policy, and our views on international order, not only to President Obama, but also to the American people.
Of course, a great deal of cooperation between these two countries, but there are areas of dissension between the two countries. One of those areas is U.S. accusations of Chinese cyber attacks on U.S. government institutions, on U.S. companies. It has led the U.S. to say that this puts a significant strain on the bilateral relationship if not resolved. How can this be resolved?
Well, I think China and the United States are two very different countries in terms of the history, culture, and political system, economic development, and maybe also in many other aspects. So it's only natural that we do have differences between us, sometimes very important differences. But still, our shared interests outweigh any possible differences This is quite clear. We have much larger common interests than any possible differences between us. As for the differences, I think we have to handle them, manage them in a very constructive spirit. Because confrontation will not help either side. For instance, the issue of cybersecurity. We are the two largest economies of the world. Both countries are very dependent on cyberspace. And the United States is the most advanced country, technologically speaking, in cyberspace. China has the largest number of internet users. So we do have a common need and a common interest to respond to cyber threats, to manage the cyberspace and make sure that it will not be disruptive to the economic and social function of the two countries. I think this is a common interest. So I believe the two countries have to focus on this common need, try to work out a set of rules or a joint approach to deal with this new issue, rather than accusing each other or having some conflicts or even confrontation in this area, because it will not help us to solve the problem. It will only make things worse for both countries.
Another difference, and this is a significant difference, is the criticism we hear in the United States over Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea. China says it's merely protecting its sovereignty, but it has led to tensions between the two countries. How do you go about easing those tensions?
Well, first of all, and honestly, I have to point out that what happens in South China Sea is not an issue between China and the United States, because the United States, according to the official position of the US government, the United States has no territorial claims in South China Sea. So as far as the territorial issue is concerned, this is not and should not be an issue between China and the United States. So sometimes I'm quite puzzled why the US or some people in the US are making this an issue between us. This should not be an issue between us. As you said rightly just now, what China is doing is just to defend our long-standing position on our territorial integrity in South China Sea.
We've also heard a lot over the past 2 years, I would say, about the so-called US pivot to Asia, or rebalancing as it's sometimes called. This is a bigger American military presence in the South China Sea, in the Pacific. Does this contribute to instability in the area, to more tensions in the area?
I think this is a very good question. There have been many versions of this pivoting or rebalancing or returning to Asia or whatsoever. But if we look back at the situation in the last few years, certainly there are new sources of instability, perhaps because of this policy, because of this approach. So I think the United States, I would suggest that the United States would think hard about the real effect this approach has had in the region. Is it help us to maintain greater stability and greater prosperity, or is it working in the opposite direction?
Well, there are disputes, but one also has to look at the two-way trade between these two countries. It's now worth $550 billion a year, yet differences do remain. The United States and its allies have excluded China from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The US has stayed away from the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Bank. There's also been debate in the United States here on the merits of President Xi Jinping's economic regional initiative, the One Belt, One Road initiative. Where do you see economic cooperation going in the future?
Well, you see, bilaterally, as you said, bilateral trade is growing very fast, and two-way investment is also growing very fast. So economically, the two countries are increasingly interdependent. We in China, we want very much to see a stronger growth in the US economy. I think many people in the US would also want to see a strong growth of the Chinese economy because this is in our mutual interests. And regionally speaking, the Asia-Pacific region is in need of closer regional cooperation and economic integration. And the region is in need of much better infrastructure building. That's why we propose this Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And as the Chinese economy grows and expands, there's a growing need for connectivity between China and our neighbors, and even beyond. So the economic force is driving the initiatives such as One Belt, One Road, and other initiatives China is taking regionally. And globally speaking, since we are the two biggest economies in the world, and we are both members of G20, we are important members in such international institutions as IMF, World Bank, WTO, and so on. We have shared responsibility to improve global economic governance, to make it more effective, more efficient, more responsive to the growing needs globally. So I think at the level of bilateral and regional and global cooperation, the need is growing that our two countries should really work with each other, not work against each other. So I hope people in the United States will have a better understanding of the global picture of China's strategy, not only for its own economic development, but also for regional prosperity, for global economic governance, and focus on the common needs and common interests, and do all these things together with China.
And talking about the two countries working together, we've already seen a great deal of cooperation on climate change and how to tackle that between China and the United States. There, of course, is a big conference coming up in Paris, climate change conference towards the end of this year. Will the United States and China lead the way, come up with a joint initiative of some kind, a joint plan of some kind, to resolve these major issues that face the world right now?
Yeah, climate change is indeed one of the major global challenges that we face today. And last November, during President Obama's visit to China, China and the United States issued a joint statement on climate change, which made a very strong and positive impact on the global process, on the international multilateral negotiations. I'm quite confident during President Xi's visit this time, the two countries will be able to agree on some joint action on climate change, which will again make a very strong and positive impact on the global process, especially on the Paris conference you just mentioned. Of course, we have to work together with other members of the international community. China and the United States, our two countries cannot solve this climate change issue just by ourselves. We need global cooperation, global efforts.
And of course, there are other formidable challenges in the world right now. The scourge of terrorism that the world faces right now, nuclear non-proliferation, other issues that have come up, sectarian warfare. When you look at these things, do these countries need each other more now than they have before?
Of course, yes. As you said, we are faced with so many regional and global challenges. I think all of them would call for much closer coordination and cooperation in the international community, especially among the major countries. And since China and the United States are both permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, we do share this responsibility.
Earlier this month, China hosted a huge parade in Beijing to commemorate the end of World War II. There were some in the United States who said that this was China flexing its muscle. How do you respond to that?
The parade was a great success, and I think there have been very positive international comments on the parade. and people in China welcome it very warmly. I think the purpose of having this parade is not to show muscle or not to intimidate anybody, but just to remind people what kind of sacrifice we made for peace 70 years ago, and how we should work together to make sure that there's no longer such a global war, there's no longer such atrocities in the world. Peace could be maintained, and our peoples, people of China, people of the United States, people of other countries, can have the expectation of living in peace and achieving greater, better standards of life. I think this is the purpose of the parade, and I think the message is well received globally.
We've just seen one area of cooperation, and this has been making news over the past few hours, and that is the United States has repatriated to China one of China's most wanted economic fugitives. What did you make of that?
Anti-corruption is an area that our two countries should have closer coordination and cooperation, because it is against the laws of both countries, it is against the economic interests, the sound economic development of both countries, and it is certainly immoral. So I hope that there will be even more such cases of cooperation between our two countries. No country should be used as a so-called safe haven for corruption or such crimes.
Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, my great pleasure.